Hi, I'm Janine Lanouette. If you're a professional screenwriter or a writer-director, you know how much rides on that moment when you decide your script is ready to send out to the people who can help you get it produced. How do you know when your script is finished? I don't have a foolproof method for determining when your script is perfect. It'll never be perfect. But I do have 5 questions to consider that can help you determine if the draft you have in your hand is at least putting across a cohesive story. When you are confident you have a good story, then you will know how to advocate for it as you begin showing it to others. The first question to consider is this: does your story go from A to B? There are many definitions of story out there, but for me, it comes down to one fundamental requirement. You have to go from point A to point B. This may seem self-evident, but it's important to understand that it is the potential for a story to take us somewhere truly different from where we started that gives it that sense of purpose, of payoff. Something must be gained. So how do you make sure your story has arrived at a genuinely satisfying point B? In my way of looking at story, there are actually 3 types of point B, which brings us to the second question. Is the A to B progression in your story an action story, a character story, or a theme story? In an action story, by which I mean simply the plot, the point B is an external accomplishment, such as the triumph over an enemy. Whereas in a character story, the point B is the inner transformation of your main character. But in a theme story, the point B shows us a new understanding of the world. Once you know which of these 3 story types you're toiling in, you can start to identify your story's point A and point B, which brings us to question number 3. If all you really want to do is write an action story, action adventure, murder mystery, disaster film, horror film, whatever your pleasure, you want to take a look at what are the external circumstances of your main character at point A, and then how have those external circumstances changed, point B, and has something been accomplished at the end? I think of the action story as being where the main character is playing out his or her relationship with an immediate other, or the antagonist. That's why the most common point B is the triumph over an enemy. But it can also be solving a problem, unraveling a mystery. Any result that is external in nature is the point B of your action story. I know that's kind of fundamental, but bear with me. Maybe pure action stories are not your thing. Maybe what you're really interested in is the inner life of your main character. In that case, you want to be sure to ask question number 4. Who is your main character at point A? And then who have they become when they get to point B? When telling a character story, the focus is on the main character's internal challenges, the inner journey. Mostly we find this in the serious dramas, but romance and comedy are also fertile ground for transformations of character. You could say that in a character story, the main character is in conflict with his or her own self, and the antagonist is their internal obstacles. This is why, to measure the internal distance your main character has traveled, you want to ask, how would I describe this character at the beginning of my story? And then how would I describe them at the end? They may go from being timid to being empowered, from selfish to sacrificing, or from rigid to relaxed. There are many, many internal progressions a character can make. Then, of course, you want to look at if their internal shift happens incrementally over time, and is it authentic and plausible? But maybe, rather than delving into deep character psychology, what you really want is to make a grand statement about the world we live in, or our collective human nature. Then you're telling a theme story. And the question you need to ask for that is, how do we understand the world at point A? And then how has our understanding changed when we get to point B? The focus here is not so much on the main character's relationship to themselves or an immediate antagonist, as it is their relationship to the world at large. Therefore, if your goal is to communicate a theme, you want to examine the point A and point B of your story in the broadest possible terms, looking at the nature of the world within the story. Now, you want to make sure you have at least one of these 3 point Bs at the end of your story. But you can also have 2, such as an action film containing a character dilemma, or a character film in which something actually happens. Or you can have all 3. Not easy to do, but beautiful when done well. An interesting distinction among the 3 is that while you can have an action story that does not communicate any sort of theme, we've all seen plenty of those, you cannot create a theme story without also creating an action story through which to manifest the thematic statement. Theme is entirely dependent on action to put across the non-visual larger idea. If there's a character transformation in there too, so much the better. But that's not required. We see an example of this in the film Don't Look Up. A cautionary tale spelling out in very clear terms that behind the political inaction to address climate change, there are powerful corporate interests at work. Writers Adam McKay and David Sirota created a highly effective allegory. Two astronomers discover an asteroid heading straight towards Earth and then encounter impassable roadblocks while urging the government into action to deter imminent disaster. Let's take a look at how these 5 questions apply to Don't Look Up. 1. Does this story go from A to B? I would say that's a yes. With the extinction level impact of the comet on planet Earth, we definitely end up somewhere completely different from where we started. 2. Is the A to B progression an action story, a character story, or a theme story? To the degree that it has a classic disaster film premise, it is an action story. But there's no triumph at the end. So the action story by itself is not enough to give the film its appeal. It needs something else. A character transformation is usually enough to give purpose to a tragic ending. But this story is about the world coming to an end. To focus on one individual's character growth would seem kind of trivial next to the magnitude of planetary extinction. So by a process of elimination, that would mean it's a theme story. And indeed, writers McKay and Sirota were very clear about their intention to use this 1950s-style disaster motif as their climate change allegory. But just to make sure, let's put it to the A to B test. Which brings us to question number 3. If you have an action story, what is your point A and what is your point B? Here the answer is pretty simple. A comet is headed towards Earth, and B, the comet hits Earth. That's the progression of the external circumstances of the story. On to question number 4. If you have a character story, who is your main character at point A, and who do they then become at point B? One of the ways we know this is not a character transformation story is that there are actually 2 main characters, Kate Dibiasky and Randall Mindy. If I had to choose one of them as the main character, I would probably say it's Kate because she's just a bit more sympathetic than Randall. But neither of them have a significant transformation in their psychology. Let's ask the test questions. How would you describe Randall Mindy at the beginning of the story? I would describe him as fighting for survival. How would you describe Randall Mindy at the end of the story? For me, he's resigned to fate. Not much growth there. How about Kate Dibiasky? How would you describe Kate at the beginning of the story? I would describe her the same, fighting for survival. How would you describe Kate at the end of the story? Again, resigned to fate. So what is their function in the story then, if they're not giving meaning to a tragedy through character transformation? Everything has to have a function. And I think Kate and Randall serve a very needed function in the story as our voice of reason. They are the sane ones amidst all the craziness, greed, stupidity, and willful denial that surrounds them. In that sense, we're glad they don't change. They're already about as evolved as we could hope for. We'd hate to see them devolve to become more like the crazy people. We're glad we have at least those 2 consistently expressing cold common sense in a fantasy-driven world. So, no character transformation. This story is not the place for it. This brings us to question number 5. If you want to communicate a theme, how is either the world itself or our understanding of the world different from point A to point B of the story? Clearly, by the end of this film, the world itself has changed. But more important than that is how our understanding has changed. I realize for many viewers, the film's message is not news, but its intended audience is people who do not fully understand the depth of our problem. Let's approach this as if we have the mindset the filmmakers are speaking to. Going into the film, we may well have thought we live in a world in which the job of political leadership is to work for our collective survival. Certainly that's what Randall and Kate think when they first go to NASA with their discovery, and then to the White House. But we see them met with obstacle after obstacle and ultimately fail to save the world, literally. From this, we find out that we actually live in a world in which the greed of corporate leadership will ultimately destroy us. I don't think that message can be stated any more clearly than it is in this film. To sum up, pure plot can tell a story all by itself, and when done well, can create a highly effective diversion. But add a character story to the mix, and you provide insights into human nature along with the thrills and chills. Put them all together to create a metaphor, and you have the potential for concrete embodiment of larger meaning, which is what human beings crave once they tire of all the superficial diversion. This is why the screenplay with cohesive action, character, and theme storylines is the one that will stand out in the slush pile of screenplays waiting to be read by your potential producing partners. And once you begin to have conversations with those producers, agents, executives, financiers who you're trying to get on board with your project, you'll have a basis from which to advocate for your story, just in case they start asking you to make a bunch of changes that don't serve the story you're trying to tell. I have a helpful tool for thinking about how action, character, and theme storylines interact with each other. It's a wheel chart called Action Need Not Always Be on Top: 6 Ways to Rethink Character and Theme. I made this interactive graphic to challenge the idea that screenwriting is a hierarchy with action on top. Rather, I see the relationship between action, character, and theme as a circle. Click on the link in the description below to see what I mean by that. And thanks for watching. I'm going to be releasing more videos showing A to B progressions, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss them.